hello, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. All right. Okay. In this live stream, we're going to talk about randomness in tidal cycles. I think it's a topic I take for granted quite a bit because I use randomness a lot in my patterns when either composing or performing, and I think I forget how much I use it and also kind of work around it. And I use a lot of functions to deal with randomness. So let's just start with something simple. Let's start with a melodic sample like arpy. And let's make it a little bit louder. And so there's a lot of things you can do to introduce randomness in tidal cycles. So the first thing I'm going to show is how to use randomness in a control pattern. So if I want to vary the panning, or the amount of the sound that's in the right or left channel, I can use the pan function. Now normally by default it's at 0.5. But you can just give it the rand function. So rand is a first class function in tidal, and if you give pan the value of rand, it will randomly pan each time a sample is played. So it sounds like this. So that should be coming through on the stream. Each time that sample is played, it's in a different place. You can even scale it so that, or define a range of random values. So let's say I wanted pan to be anywhere between center and right. I can scale the random function with a range. So I can say 0.5 to 1. That should pan it to the right, or randomly pan it from the center to the right somewhere, like so. And if I wanted to do it to the left, I could say 0 to 0.5. So rand generates a value between 0 and 1. So for pan, this works great. If I wanted to change the speed randomly, you probably don't want to use a rand value between 0 and 1 for speed, because that will generate a very low speed. We can try it. Sounds like this. So some of those speeds are very slow, near 0. For functions where you want a value that's a little larger, the range comes in handy. Maybe I want to scale it between 1 and 2. You can do that. Or you can go to any high value you want. So if you scale speed up high enough, you can get even a percussive effect, I suppose. Like that. So that's a very easy way to use random, or to introduce some randomness. You can even yeah, so I'm going to leave it at that. So control patterns, that's one way to do randomness. So I'm going to make a note here before I just kind of keep track of what I've talked about here. So rand for control patterns. The other thing is you can introduce randomness for like pattern transforms, or the functions that are on the kind of on the left side of your patterns. So what do we call these? So sometimes transforms, I guess. There is a function called sometimes, which will allow you to pass in a function to apply to your pattern, and it happens sometimes, of course. What that means is 50% of the time, so for 50% of the samples played, it will do whatever you put in this function. So if I say speed 0.5, it will, let's do 2. So for 50% of the notes that are played, it will randomly increase the playback speed by a factor of 2. So if I take that out, here's the normal pattern, and here's with sometimes applied. With sometimes, there's also sometimes by, which allows you to specify the probability. So by default, sometimes is 50% or 0.5. So if you wanted 0.4 or 40% of the time, you could use sometimes by. And so if you want something to happen pretty often, you can use 90% probability. There's also some other shortcut functions called off. So there's sometimes, there's also rarely and often. And they have some default percentages baked in. So rarely, I think, is 0.25, I think. So 25% of the time is rarely. Often, I misspelled transforms. Very important that I correct that. Then there's also often, which I think is 75% of the time. But of course, you've got ultimate control with sometimes by. Yeah. So, yeah, that's at the surface. That's it. But there's so much more. But wait. So, okay, what happens if you want to do two things at the same time? So what if I want to say sometimes speed 2, and then also sometimes pan 1, let's say. So if we do this, listen carefully to what happens. So what happens is the pan to the right and the doubling of the speed both happen with the same randomness. So when one happens, so does the other. And that's because randomness is the same within the same cycle in a pattern. So when I say sometimes, if you have another sometimes in the same pattern, they're both going to fire at the same time. Sometimes this is a desirable thing, sometimes it's not. So what you need to know is if you want to be able to control that or not. I have found it, one place where I have enjoyed doing this is, or having it fire at the same time. There's also another function called degrade, which will remove notes from your pattern at random. So degrade will remove 50% of the notes played. And there's also degrade by, which allows you to specify a percentage. And why I'm showing you this is if I have two different patterns, both with the same cycle number, the same randomness used, they both have the same effect. So in this case, the same degradation of the pattern will happen in both patterns. So if you want the same random effect, this is actually kind of good. I can also take a pattern. Let's see, what's a good example? If I striate something, 16. I'm not sure what this is going to sound like.
You still there? Are 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 you?
So in this case, even with a pattern where I'm striating or granulizing the sample into 16 chunks and then degrading it, it allows this bass drum pattern that has 16 steps that's being degraded at the same amount. They both have the same degradation. So the granules or the grains that are kept match the bass drum notes that hit at the same time. Okay, so that's an example of when you want the same randomness. But let's go back to the other example that I started with, where let's go back to our RP pattern. And if I say sometimes speed 2 and sometimes pan 1, so again, because the sometimes functions are used in the same pattern at the same cycle, the pan effect to the right and the doubling of the speed happen at the same time. So what if you want the speed change or the speed randomness and the pan randomness to be different? What you need to do is ensure that that the two sometimes functions happen on different cycles. And you can do that by just using the shift or rotate function, this arrow tilde. I guess this is a angled bracket, not an arrow, but I digress. Okay, but if you shift the cycle around between the two random functions, then they become separate. They generate random numbers on different cycles. The tidal patterns kind of go from right to left, at least in my mind. So this, we have our samples playing, then sometimes the notes will be panned to the right, then we shift the cycle around, and then another probability happens where sometimes we pitch up some of those samples. So anyway, here's the result. So now the pitch or the speed change is, its randomization is separate from the pan randomization. So in a lot of my patterns, I like to have the randomization be separate. So I do this sort of thing all the time. Let's talk about control patterns again. If we go back to speed, and then if we do range, rand, so if we just randomly change the pitch or the playback speed. And the same thing applies to control patterns. So if we go back to pan and then also just apply a random value to pan. So if you listen closely, what's happening is the rand is, again, being shared between pan and speed. Let me pitch down the range more here. And actually, let me just make this range bigger. So if you listen closely, the low playback speed is going to match being panned to the left, and the high playback speed of 4 times will be panned to the right. that's because, again, rand is being shared on the same cycle by speed and pan. So in a control pattern, if you want to have these functions not share the same cycle, you have to rotate it within the control function. So let's say on pan, I can just rotate by a cycle and then separate it by a $ and then rand. So now the two randomization functions are not sharing the same cycle. And so we don't have this matching of speed and panning in the same place. So here's what it is when they're the same again. So all the low notes are on the left, the high notes are on the right. You know what's funny? I'm monitoring myself with earbuds. I don't know if I have the left and right earbuds in my left and right ears. Let me check, because otherwise I'm saying something completely wrong. Okay, they are correct. Okay, so, but again, if we want to separate that, we just rotate one of them over by a cycle, and now they don't share the same random numbers. Okay, so, all right, we've talked about rand, sometimes by, rarely, often. There's degrade. We've talked about moving cycles around. So let's get into some slightly more advanced stuff. So if you start to pile on a lot of control patterns, so we've got speed, pan, what else could we use here? What's a good example? Let's do accelerate. Accelerate. So if we accelerate rand, and let's say we want it to be a different random, or have different random values than speed or pan, we need to move it over by even a different number of cycles. Is there another one we could do? What if we do we'll just leave it at that. So it sounds like that. But the more randomness you start to introduce, it gets kind of annoying to, at least in my opinion, to manually type this paren, number, left brace, tilde, paren. Except for the number, you're using the shift key for all that stuff. And if you're using a lot of randomness, it's a lot to type. So what I would recommend is create a shortcut function. And what you can do is just create your own function with let. And then I've been using the name shift. And just basically create an alias for the shift over by 1. And so if you just have something quick you want to do, you can just type shift. And if you want to be able to control how much you're shifting, then you can create another function. So we can call it shift by and then n. And then we can put the variable n in our rotation function. So now we've got a shift by 2. And if we wanted to be really crafty, we could say shift equals shift by 1. And reuse the functions we've already got. Okay, so this is, in my opinion, a faster way of varying the randomness, because then you don't have to do so much with the shift key with typing these parens and tildes and so on. I forgot a big thing called choose. So let's talk about choose. So let's create a simple pattern again here. So let's say I want to choose between choose values from a specific list. So if I want speeds speeds in the set of, let's say 1, 1.25, 1.5, 2, 0.5, just some nice round numbers. What I can do is create my list like this, and then I can just say choose. So choose will pick from a list of values on every step. And just like Rand, it shares kind of the same rules about using the same randomness per cycle with other randomness or other choose functions. So if I pan and then choose specific values here as well, in particular, if I have a list of the same length, it would produce the same choices as another function. So actually, let's just do that. So if I do 1, 0.25, I don't know if I'm explaining this very well, but I'm trying to get two lists with the same number of elements in each of them. 0.3, 0.7. Okay. So I've got two lists with the same number of elements in each. So now what happens is the same random speed will be used as the same random pan. Did I say that right? The random speed will be the same as the random pan every time. So when this choose function for speed picks 1.25, it will always be panned at 1. So these list values are the same. So if you want, again, to have these two choose functions be different, just like I did with Rand, you'll have to move this over by a cycle. Or we can use our shift by. So now the speeds and pans are truly separate. Somebody's playing piano in the house. And it's not me. Okay. So again, in my opinion, these types of little shortcut functions save you a lot of typing and a lot of use of that shift key by just typing shift. You can even remove the capital B and make a shift B function to reduce the number of shift key usage. But yeah, so you can use if you're using a lot of randomness in your patterns with choose or rand, the shifting is necessary if you want the randomness to be different. Let's go back to, if I do accelerate, rand, and then what's another one? What's another control pattern? We don't need one. Then we'll do sometimes. We'll do sometimes rev. We'll do sometimes. Or how about rarely? Brack. And often. Jux rev or something like that. By default, all of this stuff would happen kind of using the same kind of random, the same random number. So what happens is, right now I've got 6 functions or 6 things that all are using randomness. And if I don't break up the cycles, they're all going to interact in the same way at the same time. So if I want them to be more random, again, we just use our shift trick. and shift by, oh, I'm sorry, I'm doing this wrong. I'm doing this wrong. With the transform functions on the left-hand side, so on, you know, our rhythm is defined by our sound pattern. So anything over on the left, we'll have to put a shift by in between these functions. And I'm not going to be able to explain this very well. These could all be shift by 1 because then it'll make them all a different cycle. But you know, you can put whatever number in here if you really want to. And then shift by 3. I'm just making up numbers. Shift by 4 and shift by something. So it starts to make your patterns kind of long, but if splitting up the randomness is important to you, then this is something you'll have to do. Yeah. I also have another shortcut function I use if I'm just shifting and calling rand, if I'm just generating a value between 0 and 1. I call it shrand, which is an n, which is just shift by n rand. And then I can just call shrand and then a number. All right. Completely goofy patterns, but I'm trying to illustrate how this stuff works. Okay, so yeah, so again, if you have stuff on the left side of your rhythm and you're using these transform functions, you'll need to shift between each one to change the cycle number between each one to get a different randomness to happen. And then otherwise in your control patterns, wrap your randomness function in some parens, and then on the left-hand side, just shift it around. I think, is there anything else? I think there's a function, and I've never used it. Let's learn something together, shall we? If we go to the TidalCycles site, and I think it's called some cycles and some cycles by. I've never used these. So let's learn together. But it's another source of randomness. Some cycles similar to sometimes, but instead of applying the given function to random events, it applies to random cycles. Okay. Hopefully, I don't know if that piano is coming through. Hopefully it's not too distracting. So let's create a pattern. Let's do RP16 again. And so let's say some cycles. And then let's do speed 2. And let's see what happens. All right, so I'm going to close the door. Hold on, be right back. Sorry about that. I don't know if anybody else could hear the piano, but it's kind of driving me nuts. Okay, so this thing. So what's happening, I believe, is it is taking this function we want to apply, and for 50% of cycles, it will apply this speed 2 for an entire cycle. So normally it's speed 1. For an entire cycle, it might be speed 2. And of course, we can do some cycles by, where we can specify the probability. So if we give it a 25% chance, an entire cycle will be speed 2. We can do some cycles by 0.25. Yeah, so most speeds just stay at 1 and some cycles are 2. So there's that as well. Let's add that to our list. Some cycles and some cycles by. So there's a comment that it would make sense to use shrand for all random functions. To that, I say yes. In fact, if I bring up a pattern I was working on here, if you just look, this is a composition. This is not something I would type live, but I'm doing shift, shrand, shift, range, shrand, shift. I mean, I use this stuff everywhere, and that's because I want all my randomness. Sorry, I'm blocking my camera here, but that's because I want all the randomness to be truly different in all of its uses. So I shift stuff around constantly. So yeah, maybe what was being suggested here is just bake shrand into the random function itself, but at the beginning of the stream, I suggested you may actually want randomization to be shared between two different things. So again, if I do degrade, so we take one pattern, so in this case the synth note and the bass drum are both being degraded by the same amount, so they're sharing the same randomness. And I've used that for a lot of cases as well, where I want kind of a random sequence to be generated just by taking notes out, and I want two things to share that sequence. So I think it makes sense where you'd want to be given the choice and not be constrained by always having randomness and title always be shifted over by a cycle. But that's my opinion. So sometimes it works. I'm curious if there's any other questions. That's about all I wanted to cover. Yeah, randomness. So thanks for watching. I've got all of these functions. So you saw me just declaring them right in a file here. I've actually got a functions file in my editor. So I've got kind of a project or a folder where I always open up, and I've got a functions file in here, and I've got about 100 lines of functions that I use. So my shift and shrand, all that stuff is defined in this file. So when I boot up Tidal, I actually just evaluate this big block of functions. And I don't use about 3/4 of them, but sometimes they come in handy. But yeah, so I just put these custom definitions of shifting that I put here. Those normally would just be in this file, and I just evaluate this thing every time I start. You could put this in a custom boot up file. So I'm using the Visual Studio Code editor, but Atom or Emacs or Tidal Vim, you've got the ability to put your own custom functions in a boot up file too. I could certainly do that. In fact, I think I do have. Yeah, I won't get into that. But you can configure your own boot up file, and you can put your custom function definitions right there, so you don't have to do that, or so you don't have to evaluate it manually. Yeah. All right. Cool. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the future.